So one final way to think about the Phillips curve is to use it in a real world scenario. And so I think there are kind of two real world scenarios, one kind of from present day and one going back famously to the 1970s, to look at the lessons that NAIRU and the Phillips curve have for policymakers. So let's start with a lesson from today that I think most people and students should probably be familiar with. So we'll start this story that, of course, in 2008, the United States entered a massive recession, which of course has now become known as the Great Recession, kind of the biggest economic downturn that the economy has seen since the Great Depression in the 1920s. And we kind of at the peak of this recession, or the worst unemployment rate of this recession in 2009 to 2010, saw unemployment go up to about 10%. And we actually saw some really brief moments of deflation, but really inflation went down and kind of floated right around 0%. So let's start by graphing that. We can graph, this could be what we would call the 2008 or 2010 point in our recession, when we've got an unemployment rate pushing 10% and we've got an inflation rate at about 0%. And that, of course, all seems normal. On a short-run Phillips curve, high unemployment should correspond to very low rates of inflation. So the next thing we know is that the Fed responded by cutting interest rates. And cutting interest rates would increase aggregate demand, hopefully, and gradually over time that increase in aggregate demand would increase output, drive unemployment down, and slowly begin to increase inflation or increase price level. And that is what the Fed did. And from 2008 moving forward, we definitely saw the unemployment rate begin to come down. And of course, by about 2015 to 2016, the unemployment rate had come down all the way to around 5%. And this is where the Phillips curve begins to provide lessons for and challenges for policymakers. As that unemployment rate came down to 5%, and really a lot of economists thought that NAIRU was around 5%, they expected to see inflation beginning to rise, so that we would get by 2016 to about 5% unemployment and some rate of inflation. It turned out that rate of inflation was somewhere around 1.5%. So by 2016, we were down to about 5% unemployment and about 1.5% inflation. And this is where the Fed and all policymakers began to face a challenge and began to face kind of the lesson or trade-off of the Phillips curve. If they wanted to continue their low interest rates, those low interest rates would continue to push the unemployment rate down. And the fear, of course, is that continuing to push the unemployment rate down below that NAIRU level of 5% would at some point lead to a higher level of inflation. And so that's what we saw. By 2016, we saw the Fed begin to increase the interest rate. And by increasing the interest rate, they were really hoping to slow unemployment from going too far beyond NAIRU. Now, this story gets far more complicated because really, as this unemployment rate continued down, in fact, we know that today in 2020, the 3.5% unemployment rate is still aligning with about a 2.5 or a 1.5% inflation rate. And so we put a big question mark there because the Fed and a lot of people are not entirely sure why this is happening. And there's a few theories here. One theory is that perhaps we just estimated NAIRU. Maybe 3.5 or even lower is a rate of NAIRU. And so we won't see that inflation accelerate until we get way lower. The other guess, or another guess, and potentially a fear, is that the inflation rate might be on a little bit of a lag, and that at some point we will see a big burst of inflation. Though as inflation has remained low well into these low unemployment rates, we haven't seen that yet. But regardless of how well this has actually worked, and so far, the Phillips curve is starting to show some major holes in it, this trade-off is really one of the primary uses for the Phillips curve in terms of its most basic assumptions. That, policymakers expanding the economy coming out of a recession makes sense, but right here, if we keep expanding, is there some risk of where we might wind up? Might we wind up at a much higher inflation rate? And if we really drove ourselves down there, that higher inflation rate could then become what we would consider a normal inflation rate, which is the extra scary part of that scenario. The other classic example comes from Fed Chairman Paul Volcker in the 1970s into the 1980s in response to the 1970s stagflationary period. And you might remember the stagflation of the mid and late 1970s in the Ford and Carter eras from your U.S. history classes or from your econ classes. But we can kind of do the same setup. We have a level of NAIRU and a kind of what we would expect the economy to be doing at any given time, and maybe that is that you expect, again, 5% inflation to correspond to something like 3% or 5% unemployment to correspond to something like 3% inflation. But in the 1970s, we know that the economy was facing stagflation. And stagflation is an increase in the unemployment rate and an increase in the inflation rate, which we always joke is every economist's worst nightmare, because this is the rightward shift or the increase in the SRPC. That the only way to get these two things is for SRPC to be increasing, right? I need high unemployment. In fact, we had unemployment that was pushing, at one point about 7%. And then we had incredibly high inflation. Inflation was up around 10%. And so we had this Phillips curve that was potentially way out to the right here, representing a really bad situation for our economy. And so Paul Volcker and the Fed and a lot of policymakers were kind of forced with a choice here. What do we do? Do you try to, step one or option one, I could decrease my unemployment rate by using expansionary policies, but we know that if we tried to decrease our unemployment rate, the result of decreasing our unemployment rate would be to drive inflation even higher. So if I wanted to decrease my unemployment rate, I'd have to drive inflation up way above 10%. And there were times in the 1970s where inflation really started to cross 15%, at least for a few brief moments. Option two was that we could fight the inflation, but we know that in the short run that also comes with a pretty bad trade-off, right? If I try to drive my inflation down, I'm going to get a higher level of unemployment. So I could kind of drive my inflation back down, try and get it back down to 3% or somewhere close to 3%. But in doing so, I might have unemployment that is significantly higher. And, this could be 10% or even higher over here. And so the question is, what is an economist to do? What is Paul Volcker going to do in this situation? Well, very famously, Paul Volcker selected option number 2. He chose to fight inflation by creating a recession. And when we say he created a recession, a little monetary policy review, he decreased the money supply and drove up interest rates, and those things decreased spending and aggregate demand in the economy, which drove output down and drove unemployment up. But that high unemployment rate and that low output rate drove prices down and began to drive inflation down. So Volcker picked option 2, and he said, I'm going to decrease my inflation rate and increase my unemployment rate. And in fact, he did push in the early 1980s, he pushed unemployment all the way up to about 10%. But in pushing unemployment all the way up to about 10%, prices began to drop and the inflation rate began to come down and came down to around 5%. And at first, this looks like it's good for the inflation rate, bad for the unemployment rate, and that we're still stuck way out here. So how is this in any way a solution to the problems of the 1970s? And this is where NAIRU and the long-run correction of the economy comes in. Volcker was betting on NAIRU, and he was betting on people's inflation expectations changing over time. And that actually did begin to happen. When prices came down, when inflation came down, and when it was held down for long enough, expectations of inflation began to come down. And by the early 1980s, expectations of inflation were coming down, and as expectations of inflation came down, the SRPC shifted down or to the left. And by the mid-1980s, we had returned to a point of a relatively low rate of unemployment and a much lower rate of inflation. In other words, Volcker knew that the unemployment rate would always return to NAIRU regardless of what the inflation rate was. So instead of accepting high inflation, Volcker fought the high inflation and forced inflation down to a lower level, and then allowed that low inflation rate to push back to NAIRU and push the economy back to normal once people accepted that inflation was going to be lower. And so we again see here two kind of big and really cool lessons of what the Phillips curve and what NAIRU can do for us in very direct sense. In our first example, again, we see questions that policymakers have to ask them. Should I continue a policy, understanding the potential consequences of NAIRU? And Volcker in the 1970s, using his understanding of NAIRU and using the understanding of inflation and inflation expectations to drive inflation down and bring unemployment back to a normal level. And ultimately, when you really put this together, that's the end of stagflation. And if you want to, go look up the numbers on this, but since the mid-1980s, inflation in the United States has never really gotten anywhere close to 3 or 4%, or really crossed that 3 or 4% threshold, let alone gotten anywhere near to the 15 and 10% inflation levels of the 1970s. And our inflation rates now are so low that a lot of people think that's contributing to the questions and the problems of today in terms of where is that NAIRU threshold where our economy is going to see a spike in inflation, and nobody knows.